Hi, everyone. As you know, we are not meeting tonight on Zoom. So, because we have a lot to cover related to assessment, I decided to go ahead and record this presentation. In this, we're going to go over the different types of assessment and think about how we might use those assessments so that when we come back together next week, we'll be able to just summarize, kind of go over the highlights of assessment and jump into lesson planning. That said, lesson planning. I am going to record another presentation here after I finish this one, going over the guidelines and expectations for the lesson planning assignment. Because, let me just go here a moment, if I can get my computer to cooperate. I made some changes to the course outline, which I shared with you last week via email. Like we talked about in class, the assessment project is no longer on the table. However, I did add an optional opportunity for you to submit a draft of your lesson plans at the end of next week, which would be February 26th. So anyway, I just wanted to kind of go over that quickly. All right, so let's jump in here to our materials. We are rolling right through our discussion of backward design. This week, you'll finish up your standards and objectives assignment, where you'll work through these first 4 steps in backward design. And today, we're going to be learning more about assessments that measure the achievement of the objective that you have identified from the standard that you used in your project. So last week we looked at the cycle. We're going to continue on talking about this cycle today, focusing primarily on this second step of observing and documenting. So gathering assessment data, thinking about why we want to gather data, different ways to gather data that makes sense for whatever it is that we want to know. So typically, like we said last week, that's our lesson objective. Why do we want to gather this assessment data? What is it? When are we going to gather it? And that's all related to our lesson objectives. So we talked a little bit last week about assessment and how we think about assessment. And there are a lot of different reasons why we assess young children. The primary focus that we'll have for this course is to think about those first 2 points, to monitor development and learning, and to guide planning and decision making. We'll also talk a little bit more about next week about reporting and communicating our findings from our assessment data. But the next 8 weeks of your class, when you take Special Ed 374, is where you'll learn a lot more about how you can use assessment to identify children who may have special needs or disabilities. So as we shared last week, the primary focus of assessment for this course is on thinking about a child's ongoing growth and development and how we measure that. So what we'll be doing this semester is focusing on the ongoing process of assessment. I apologize for that. The dog is being very noisy. So when we think about what this looks like, we're thinking about how we are obtaining information from a variety of sources to make judgments about what the child knows and understands. You learned in your readings, I believe you did these for last week, possibly even the week before, that assessment in early childhood education has quite a long history, but the ways that we use assessment today are very different than the ways that children were assessed in the past. So we now know that we want to be using authentic assessment as much as possible, We know that standardized testing is not best for children, and we know that, well, young children specifically, but I would argue all children. And over time, a number of different programs and laws have come and gone related to assessment. Some of the issues and trends in assessment that were identified in your textbook, we're thinking about the 1980s when assessment became more commonplace in our educational system as the special education laws were passed in the late 70s. That became more of a need for identifying children who had disabilities. And then in 2001, when No Child Left Behind was passed as a federal law, that really took assessment and testing to another level. But you see these points underneath. There were a lot of questions that were also raised about the appropriateness of testing for, say, infants and toddlers and young children and students with disabilities and English language learners. And so that led us to more present day, where we're looking at more authentic ways to assess students whenever possible to account for the unique needs, culture, language, abilities of the children in our classrooms. So in Chapter 2, we learned a lot about best practices in assessment. And so one of the things that I would always have you think about is using multiple sources for your assessments. So basically what this means, and this is in special education law as well, is that we never want to base major decision about, like, say, placement of a student or things like that on one data source. I'm actually arguing with my daughter's school district about this at this very moment, because they use benchmark testing to place students in different math and language courses, and that's they use this one test one time of the year to make really critical, important decisions about where a child is placed. And it's fine to use things like benchmark testings or testing for some things, but you want to use that in conjunction with other data points as well. So when we think about best practices, we want to think about it being developmentally appropriate. We talked about authentic assessment, and we want to make sure that we can, whenever possible, assess students doing what they would normally be doing. Because when we sit a child down and ask them 50 questions and it takes a half an hour, that's not developmentally appropriate, right? Because a child is not intended to engage for that long of a period of time. And so chances are, if we were to do that, it would skew our results, because the child wouldn't be able to sit still that long, and it wouldn't be a very accurate measure of what the child actually knows. Which gets us to valid and reliable assessments. So when we think about validity of an assessment, it really refers to the test measuring what it's intended to measure. So in the example of pulling a child aside and asking them to answer 50 questions that take a half an hour, if a child gets very squirmy and is not paying attention and is having a hard time engaging, then they're probably going to do poorly on that test, right? They're doing poorly on that test because they can't sit still, not because they don't know the answers to the questions that you're asking them. So that then makes that not a valid measure, because they're not able to perform well, not because they don't know what you're asking them, but because of other circumstances. So when we think about reliability of an assessment measure, it's how consistent the test is. So if I give an assessment in the morning and I give it in the afternoon, or I give it one day and then a week later, I should get similar results. So, or two tests that are very similar, that are reliable, I could give over different points in time. Yes, you would expect to see some growth, but the patterns and trends in that data would be pretty consistent. And that has to do with the reliability of a measure. We also want to think about other things like making sure that we're taking into account a child's language abilities, their native language, their native language or first language, their culture, which gets us to involving family as well. In the chapter about assessing infants and toddlers, many of you know this because you work with infants and toddlers, and some of you wrote about this in your discussion points for this week, is that when we're assessing infants and toddlers, we really rely heavily on observational assessment, and we are the ones who are observing and documenting what we see, taking pictures, doing videos, things like that, because obviously the infants and toddlers can't respond to us. We're not going to pull a baby aside and be like, okay, Jordan, what do you know today? Right? So it's oftentimes the case that with infants and toddlers, we assess more frequently because babies change and develop so rapidly that we need to be documenting their growth and progress and development towards developmental milestones and all of those different things very regularly so that we can make determinations about any types of developmental delays that we may be encountering. When we think about assessing young children, so preschool through second grade age children, like I said, there are often standardized assessments that are used for things like screening to determine if a child has special needs or disabilities or developmental delays, and also benchmarking, as I shared, having baseline data when a child enters a program so that we know where they're at when they start, and then continuing on with those types of assessments throughout the year so that we can look at progress. Those are more standardized types of assessments. Those are not the types of assessments that we would use for lesson planning, for example. Those types of assessments would be more like these that are listed below. So doing observations to document what we're seeing. Observational assessments often are accompanied with checklists or rubrics, rating scales, anecdotal notes. We may also collect actual work samples and take pictures and put them into portfolios. And so we'll think through and talk about each of these different levels of assessment and how you might use this type of data to inform your lesson planning, your teaching, and the progress that individual students are making as well as groups of students. So in your Where Great Teaching Begins book, you read about how we link objectives with assessment, right? So last week we talked about objectives a lot, and we talked about how adding the degree or what we expect students to do and to what degree or how much, that's really one of the best ways that we can think about assessing or measuring what it is that we want students to learn in our objectives. So to help us think through this link between objectives and assessments, we might ask ourselves things like, how would the student show me that they've met this objective? And in your standards and objectives assignment, you are doing performance criteria. And that's what you're doing in that section of that assignment, is thinking through, how would I know if a student met this objective? What would they do to show me that they met this objective? And that then links to your assessment of, well, how would I document that, right? So if I had to share with a child's parents or my principal that a student had met an objective, how would I show them or how would I demonstrate to them that this student had met this particular objective? And so our objectives really do lead us to assessment. So when we're thinking about our assessment designs, we want to be thinking about how we can assess different lesson objectives, what it would look like if we had assessments that aligned with our objectives, which types of assessments align best with higher and lower level objectives, etc. So as we've talked about in class, um, two primary forms of assessment that we use for more ongoing types of assessment in lessons are formative and summative. So I should have these flipped around. So when we think about formative assessments, these are the types of assessments that we conduct during lessons, and it informs our next steps. These are things that we might do, like asking questions or doing checks for understanding throughout our lesson that helps us to determine if students are learning and are understanding and following it, what we're trying to teach them. Summative is really summing it up, right? It's at the end. It's cumulative. It's often used to, at the end of a lesson or even a unit, for us to really think through, okay, did the students understand, meet this objective, meet these learning outcomes that we set, and how do I know? All right, so formative as you go, summative at the end. One thing that I want us to be thinking about, we talked a little bit earlier about multiple measures. We also want to think about multiple ways of viewing each individual child as well as groups of children when we're gathering assessment data. So we want to think about this notion that you read about in your textbook of multiple windows, providing us a better panoramic view or a full picture of what the child is able to do, know, and understand. So we want to think about using multiple sources of information. So gathering direct work samples from the child, doing direct observations of the child, but also interviewing other people and gathering data from other sources. Thinking about different methods of obtaining information. So maybe using checklists, anecdotal notes, pictures, interviews of other people. Thinking about assessing in different contexts, different settings, different situations. This all will help us to get a better view of what the child truly knows and understands. The good news is that you probably are already doing this in a variety of ways, but maybe you've never really stepped back and thought about how you're assessing children and kind of putting those pieces together for measuring ongoing growth and progress towards specific goals and outcomes. So when we think about multiple windows, I've told you before, I'm a very visual person. So I literally sometimes think about like a child being kind of like a house. And this sounds a little bit creepy because I'm talking about looking in people's windows, which I would never actually promote you doing. But if you think about our illustration here of this house and these different doors and windows, if we think about this as a child, right? So imagine this house as a child, and each window that we might look in or open, or door that we might open, is a different area of development or a different academic area that we need to know more about, that we need to assess to be able to determine if a child is making growth and progress or not. So if you think about it, if we only look in one of these windows or only open one of these doors, that's all we're going to see, right? So if I only look in the front door of this one door, this one part of the child's development, I'm only going to learn about their social and emotional skills, which is super, super important. But so is their reading, so is language skills, so are their math abilities, right? And so I need to be able to open up and look at each of these different windows or different areas or parts of what the child is learning and assess them in each of these different areas in order to get a big picture view of everything that's happening with the child. A lot of times our our curriculum will help us with that, because often curriculum guides have assessments that go with them. So like if you're using the creative curriculum, there's a good chance you're using the assessment that goes along with that. I think it's the gold. So sometimes you have your curriculum aligns with your assessment, and that is very helpful, or there are checklists that go along with your curriculum. But you may need to think about other ways of gathering that assessment data as well. Lots and lots of you in your discussions that I've looked at so far wrote about using observational assessment, which makes my heart happy in early childhood programs that you're relying primarily on observations to assess young children, because that's truly what you should be doing. So that's awesome. You're on the right track. It's the most authentic way that we can assess young children. The challenge sometimes with observational assessment is that it can be very subjective, which means that we might look at one situation and what we document is our interpretation of what's happening, not actually what we see and hear. So we want to try to focus our observations on naming what we see and hear, not what we think and feel. All right? So when we think about systematic observational assessments, we're looking at being intentional. We're focusing on, again, what we see, what we hear, not what we think is happening in a certain situation. All right? So we're going to watch this video for just a few seconds and then come back, and I'm going to kind of talk through this with you. And if we were in class, we'd be doing this together. But as we're observing, it helps us if we think about things like if we're focusing on one child versus multiple children, if we're looking for specific patterns of behavior, if we're looking towards progress toward a specific goal or a certain developmental area. So all of these things, it's helpful for us to have these things in mind as we're starting to do an observation. But for right now, I just want us to think about what's happening in this situation, and if you were going to document this, how you would focus only on what you're seeing and what you're hearing. Okay, so I'm going to pause this because this goes on for 5 minutes. But if you were to document what you saw in this observation, so say you're taking notes on what, let's say, these 3 boys are doing, all right? So if we were going to do some anecdotal notes, which we're going to learn about here in a few minutes, but I feel like most of you probably know because you probably use anecdotal notes in your classrooms. Some things that you might note are that there are 3 what appear to be boys, right? Or 3 children if we don't want to identify gender if we're not totally sure. 3 children, they are playing with Legos, right? They are using their fingers to add Legos on top of one another. We might make note of some of the things that they say in their conversation with one another. I believe that at least one time, one of the children asked for something and another child gave that to them. We might note that as sharing or helping types of behaviors. So we really want to focus on what we see and what we hear. What we don't want to do is make interpretations. So sometimes we might be tempted to say something like, I forget the name, 3 boys' names, Calvin, Sam, and I don't know, something. You know, like Calvin, Sam, and Johnny, let's just say, are having a great time playing with the Legos. Like, we don't really know if they're having a great time, right? That's our interpretation. Or we might, sometimes people will focus on things that don't really matter, right? Like, you know, 2 boys are wearing navy blue shirts and 1 boy is wearing a light blue shirt. Doesn't matter in the big picture or with their development, right? Or 1 boy has longer hair than the other 2. Truthfully, doesn't matter, right? So we really want to focus on what we see what we hear, and how that relates to whatever it is that we want to document about their ongoing progress and their development of certain skills and abilities. All right. So when we think about systematic observation, we observe children all day long, right? You all in your current role or in the past you're with children all day. But sometimes we can be with children, going through the motions, doing all the things that we do on a day-to-day basis, but we don't ever really stop to focus, to be systematic about what we're looking at, what we're seeing, and how we document that. All right. So we want to be thinking about how we can do that in a variety of different ways. So I want you to think about a $10 bill. I know, you're like, wait, what? What does this have to do with children? Without looking it up, not taking one out of your purse. If you're like me, you don't have one because you never have cash. Think about that $10 bill. Try to get a picture of it in your mind, the front, the back, and try to just jot down a few notes about what you can remember just from memory about a $10 bill. You might note that it's green and white because all bills are, that there's probably a 10 on it somewhere. That would probably be a safe bet. There's probably a picture of a person, also a safe bet if you bet that it's a white man who's no longer living, because I believe all of the bills, at least at this point in time, have white men who are no longer living. You might guess that the person on the front of the bill is a former president, which in this case is not true. There are only 2 bills that I know of that have dead white men on them that are not former presidents, one being Benjamin Franklin on the $100 bill, and the other being Alexander Hamilton, who's on the $10 bill. So maybe you knew that. If you've seen the play Hamilton, you know that Alexander Hamilton was the first Secretary of Treasury, which is why he's on the face of the $10 bill, which is a clue to what's on the back, which is a picture of the U.S. Treasury building. All right. So here we see, you're like, oh, right, I've seen this 1,000 times, but like without really focusing on this, it's hard to recall specific details. All right. So what does this have to do with observation of young children? Right? Without focusing on specific details that you want to gather when you're assessing children, a lot of things will just come and go, and we'll never really pay attention to it. And so we don't really ever have documentation to show if children are learning and growing in certain areas. So we want to think about how we are documenting what we see in our observational assessments. These are some different tools that we can use to document our observations. You've probably used many of these tools in your classrooms already, but maybe never really thought about how they align with lesson planning, with determining ongoing growth and progress, with sharing information back with families, and so on. So anecdotal records, sometimes called brief notes. In many cases, we use these in preschool programs and infant and toddler classrooms to document, if something's happened with a child's behavior, if somebody got hurt, what happened. You can also use anecdotal notes to document things about a child's development. So the good thing about these, they're quick, they're easy. The bad thing is that there's not a whole lot of detail included. So these are some examples of anecdotal records that a teacher might take on Angela in a first grade classroom, right? So you can see there's one about her writing, there's one about her spelling, there's one about her, out on the playground, more of the social pieces. So we can gather anecdotal records in a variety of ways and on anything that we see, but sometimes the trick is making sense of it all after the fact. So if we go to this video, and we watch just a few seconds of this, think about if you were taking anecdotal notes of what was happening here, the things that you might document or write down. All right, so if we were thinking about this, we might write down things like there were 3 children, right? They were building a tower out of, looks like these domino blocks. The tower has 1, 2, 3, 4 levels. It looks like they were building walls on the side of their tower. They were speaking in Spanish, which I do not speak, so I'm not exactly sure what they were saying. So that's something that you want to think about as you're documenting your assessments or observations, excuse me. It seemed like this girl was talking about the order, right? So she was pointing to each child. So anytime that you might write down "it seems like," that's probably your interpretation. So I just realized that I caught myself. But what we do know is that she was pointing to herself and to the other children. So that's what we would document. All right. So when we think about our assessments and our anecdotal notes, we might just jot down some brief notes that we go back to later to make interpretations, to add to really help us get a better picture of what might be happening in a certain situation with a group of children, with a individual child. Another type of documentation that you read about in the textbook is running records or narrative records. These are more detailed than anecdotal records, and they really document every single thing that you see and hear as it's happening. So the good thing about these is that they are very detailed. The bad thing is that they take a lot of time. So here you can see you might write down every single thing that you observe happening when a child is on the playground. So you're writing down all these different things over here. Over here are things like, this is what I think this means. So we want to, in our observation, focus on only what we see and hear. And then we want to think about, what does this mean? How do I interpret this? How would I use this information for planning? I want to note that running records are also something that are used in literacy assessment, but they mean very different things. So running records you'll learn about in Teach 274, I think next fall when you take that class. And that's when you observe a child reading a specific passage in a book or a chapter or something like that, and you make notes about the errors that they make and so on. So that's a different type of running record, but I just don't want you to be confused if you hear that in the future. So if we think about running records as what we just watched a few minutes ago, we would be writing down every single thing that we saw as it happened, as to the greatest extent that we could. All right. This can be really hard to do if you're the only teacher in the classroom. So most of you have co-teachers or an assistant teacher that you work with or a lead teacher you work with. So this is something that's really better done if you have more than one person in the classroom. Another type of observational assessment documentation is event or time sampling. So this can be used, or when I think about event or time sampling, it's often aligned with behavior. So if you have a child who has some problem behavior, um, usually or a lot of times you'll look at a specific activity or over a certain period of time, like 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and do a tally for each time a behavior happens. So that really helps us to get an idea of like the frequency of behaviors that are happening in a given time frame or in a certain activities or in a certain activity. The good thing about this is that we know what we're looking for, the purpose is clear. The bad thing is that it can be a little bit hard to do, again, while we're teaching, so it's better if you have this, you do this with someone else so you can observe and take notes while the other person is teaching or vice versa. So here's an example. If we think about what we might observe and how we might use a time sample in a certain situation. So Tim is a 4-year-old boy. He has difficulties with social skills, especially peer interactions, when he's required to share toys or materials. He can react violently to peers and adults when he's trying to get a toy or material. Probably experienced this before. So we are going to set a timer, and every 10 minutes for 30 minutes, we'll look and see what Tim is doing and document that. Okay? So that's one way to do a time sampling. Another thing we might do is we might write out, like, what do we see in these different areas? So he's at the Block Center at 9:30, just like a couple of anecdotal notes about, like, what do we see happening each of these times. We can also observe across these times and do tallies for the number of times that we see Tim hitting a friend, doing something he's not supposed to, etc. So checklists, woohoo, checklists. We love checklists because they're easy, they're quick. You can gather a ton of information on a lot of students very quickly and easily. Checklists are one of the tools that we will be learning about when we think about our lesson plans that we'll be developing in a couple weeks. So checklists, we can use these to document our observations. There are certain things we're looking at, certain skills, concepts, behaviors. The good thing about checklists, again, is that they're very quick. The bad thing is that they're not very detailed. They don't give us tons of information. So when I do checklists, I really have typically several columns for what it is that I'm looking for, and then a column for notes, so I can jot down a few notes. So it's kind of a combo between a checklist and anecdotal records. So thinking about this example, at the beginning of the school year, Miss Gwen wants to know which children can recognize the letters of the alphabet. As the teaching assistant reads Chicka Chicka Boom Boom, the children are asked to identify letters. Miss Gwen records the information as the children are asked about the letters. So these are the children she's observing, and she has this checklist already set out. So as David is, and Nora, Alex, whoever, is asked specific letters, she notes the ones that they're able to identify. All right, so if we look at this, we can see that there are some patterns in the letters that the children know. All right. We think about what this means and we want to interpret this information. We might note that children identify most with the letters that are in their name, right? So we can kind of see that across here. This also helps us to think about the fact that our students don't know a whole lot of letters yet, all right? So we can use this information, but we want to be cautious in how we interpret this because this is one data point at one point in time. And as you can imagine, it might be hard for Miss Gwen to really get an accurate view of what's happening because she's observing a lot going on in a very short amount of time. Okay? We may also think about how we observe behaviors for one particular child. So if we watch this video, in this video, I want you to make note of whether or not the child answers the teacher's question and if the child asks the teacher questions. Okay, I love that video. Sometime you can go back and watch more of it. But anyway, when we think about using a checklist for this observation, did the teacher ask questions? Yes. Did the child answer the questions? Yes. Did the child ask the teacher questions? I didn't see that, right? So sometimes you can see here that a yes or no gives us some information, but we might want to do like a tally or make notes about like the child answered a lot of the teacher's questions, right? Because she asked multiple questions and usually needed a little bit of prompting to really answer the question fully. So having a checklist can give us a little bit of information, but adding notes to it can give us a lot more. Another thing that you might use, it's sort of like a combo between a checklist and a rubric, which we're going to learn about next, is a rating scale, right? So we as adults are very used to like Likert scales where you have to rate something on a scale from 1 to 5, with 1 being not at all and 5 being all the time or very good, so on and so forth. And with this one, we identify the different levels in that continuum from 1 to 5, with, you know, it being whichever end, 1 being not good and 5 being amazing, or it doesn't have to be a 5-point scale. You can see here this is a 10-point scale. You can have a 3-point scale. But you have some brief criteria that helps you with a rating on that scale. So here you can see a child's comprehension related to the reading or answering questions about the Rainbow Fish book, right? So 1 being they don't do well at all, 4 being excellent. How can, you know, thinking about what responses they gave to what did the rainbow fish enjoy, tell me what happened. And so you can have the teacher, or you as a teacher would say, they didn't do this well at all, they did this amazingly well. Again, it gives you information, but not tons of detailed information, which leads us to rubrics. Rubrics are what we will use for our higher level objective small group lesson plan, okay? Rubrics give us more information. They're similar to rating scales, except for if this were a rubric, instead of just having 1, 2, 3, or 4, there would be specific criteria that goes along with that 1, 2, 3, or 4, all right? So you see here, and this one doesn't have like a 1 to 4, it has a frowny face to a smiley face. It can go either way. I tend to think of it as the least to most. This one is most to least, but you can do them either way, all right? So we have indicators, which our indicators are directly related to our lesson objectives and performance criteria. And then we have specific information or criteria that go along that break down what we would expect to see or what we might see from the worst to the best related to each of these indicators, all right? So when we think about developing rubrics, we want to think about what the total range of what we expect to see or what we think we might see might be. We want to think about a range of points, or you don't have to use points. It could be things like smiley faces, different types of criteria. Sometimes it helps to think about like what would be like acceptable, what would be good? What would be like, I'm student met this, and then work from there to what would be unacceptable and what would be like outstanding, right? So everybody does this slightly differently. I actually think sometimes it's easiest to start with like what would be unacceptable and then work from there, or what would be outstanding and then work backward. It's really up to you to think about what that might look like for your students in a specific activity. But it breaks down, what it does is it breaks down the expectations or criteria that you think are the most important things for students to learn from this lesson, which, like I said, hopefully, are related to your lesson objectives and the performance criteria that you've identified. Okay. Whew, that was a lot. And I apologize, this is so long. I am very, very windy. Windy as in I talk too much. So things to remember. Tonight, if you're watching this on Tuesday, or on Tuesday, February 14th, your discussion, I believe number 5, is due. On Sunday, your standards and objectives project is due. Next week, we will start talking about lesson planning. As I said at the beginning of this recording, I'm going to do another one of these recordings, which I hope is about 40 minutes shorter than this one is, going through the lesson plan assignment, the expectations for that assignment, the different lesson planning templates, so that you can start thinking about that and how you might want to be working on that, so you can submit a draft of that on the 26th. All right, I hope everyone is doing well. Again, I apologize for this being very, very long. Hopefully you've learned some new things. And as always, if you have questions about anything at all, always, always, always reach out to me and let me know, and I'm happy to answer them as best I can. See you next week.